what about blacks? What about reparations demands from descendants of blacks who were slave owners themselves? That is, there were black slave owners in our country, and now some of the black slave owners, they bought family members, just to get them out of slavery. But there were a number of blacks who owned slaves for the same reason that white people own slaves. And if you look at it, if you look at some of the official papers in places like in Virginia and North Carolina, you'll find blacks having mortgaged their slaves and having sold their slaves. So what do you do? What would the reparations people suggest about that? That is, I possibly could be a descendant of a black slave owner. And so, am I due reparations? Should I be forced to make reparations? The whole argument is kind of stupid anyway, as I said earlier in the broadcast. That is, I believe in individual accountability. That is, if somebody does something to you, he ought to pay. Now, there's some people say, well, America was built on the back of slaves. We were a rich country because of slavery. I'll get to that question after this. Back, and you can be on with us by calling 800-282-2882. And let's go back to the phones and welcome Brad from Fayetteville, Arkansas. Welcome.
Thank you. Hi, Dr. Williams.
Hi.
Thanks for taking my call. So far, I've been listening to the broadcast about the slave reparations march, and so far the arguments seem plausible, but I think that the fact that everyone's focusing on individual responsibility does make it seem like an absurd argument. Dead people did something to people who are dead, and should the living be held responsible? I don't think so, but maybe if we would take more of a collectivist approach and think of the benefits that this country has enjoyed over the last couple of hundred years from the sweat equity that the slaves put into the cotton industry, we would be nothing compared to what we are now had it not been for the cotton industry in the 1800s. And
this kind of goes to the question I raised before we went to break, whereby a lot of people argue, well, gee, America's rich because America's built on the back of slaves. Are you suggesting that?
Well, in a manner of speaking, and like I say, I certainly don't have the answer. My jury's still out on the ultimate issue as well. Mm-hmm. But I do think that that blacks in general still remain an underprivileged class, and whether that's sociological in nature or if it's just something that's happened.
When you say blacks are underprivileged class, more than 50% of blacks are in the solid middle class of American society.
I agree, but they still don't fully enjoy the social freedoms.
Like what, for example?
That I don't have the answer, and as a non-black person, I don't even feel qualified to address that.
I mean, well, see, I go anywhere. My American Express Gold card is taken anywhere.
Sure.
And at one time in the United States, back in the 40s and 50s, that was not true. But going back to this issue of America being built on the back of slaves, I think one of the things you have to recognize is that slavery has a very, very poor reputation for producing wealth. I mean,
how can you say that, though?
Pardon me?
How could the cotton industry have survived without?
Okay, let me ask you this question. Okay, which states in the United States were richer? Let me just pick 3 states. 6 states, but I'll give them in groups. Which states were richer? Pennsylvania, New York, and Massachusetts, or Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia?
Well, once Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia sent their cotton to
No, the race question.
Well, the northern states were certainly richer, but
right.
they were the ones selling the goods.
No, but see, the slave-rich states, that is Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, had plenty of slaves.
Sure.
But they were poor, and matter of fact, to a large extent, even after the war between the states, they remain poor.
Well, they remain poor to this day.
Right.
I'm speaking of the country as a whole and the capital that this, as a nation, we accrued during that period. Well, in a large part due to the economic advantage of having free labor.
Oh, no. Nowhere in the world, not many places in the world at least, can you point to a vibrant economy that's based on slavery. And indeed, it was after slavery when matter of fact, when Virginia was beginning to becoming a non-slave state, not a major slave state, it became wealthier than it was when it was a slave state. Now, so the point is that there are 2 points. Slavery does not have a very good reputation for building wealth, and the second point is that black people are not a group of people whom we should feel sorry for and say, well, gee, they're disadvantaged, they're this and that, and they need this handout and that handout. I mean, I think it's and you don't mean it this way, but I think it's demeaning. That is, and it's demeaning of the great progress that black Americans have made. That is, black Americans have made the greatest gains over some of the highest hurdles in the shortest period of time than any racial group in the history of mankind. And you say, why do I say that? Well, as I said earlier, that black Americans, if you just thought of, add up all the income that we earn and thought of us as a nation, we'd be the 13th, 14th richest nation. Black Americans are some of the world's most famous people. There are a few black Americans who are the world's richest people. It was a black American that headed the world's mightiest military and who is now the Secretary of State. Black Americans are some of the most famous world people in the world. Now, in 1865, neither a slave nor a slave owner would have believed that those kind of gains would be possible in just a little bit over 100 years, if ever. And as such, this progress speaks to the intestinal fortitude of a people, but just as importantly, it speaks of a great nation. That is, only in the United States of America could these gains have been possible. Nowhere else on the face of this earth. Now, to feel sorry for blacks, to be condescending to black Americans, it's insulting to this great progress that was made through blood, sweat, tears, and sacrifices of a people. We'll be back with your calls after this. We're back, and we're taking your calls, pushing back the frontiers of ignorance. By the way, the next hour, we're going to have Professor or Dr. Gerald O'Driscoll. He's with the Heritage Foundation, and we're going to talk about his recently released 2002 Index of Economic Freedom, and you'll want to stay tuned, particularly you people in the State Department, in the IMF, and the World Bank. You need to tune in. So call all your friends who are in the State Department, the World Bank, even the White House, and IMF. We'll have some interesting things to talk about that will be related to your work. Let's go quickly to the phones. Chris on the cell phone in Jacksonville, Florida. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Dr. Williams.
Hi.
Pleasure to talk to you. You are one of the most intelligent people I've heard on the radio yet.
Oh, thank you.
I'd just like to make a comment before I get to my question.
Hey, you got to be quick because we're running up against the clock.
Okay, the guy that called before, the last caller, I don't know where he's living. To say that black people are underprivileged is just kind of ignorant.
Yeah, it is.
With the ACLU and the NAACP and the affirmative action and all that, I think they have more of a chance now than they ever have in this country.
And we don't need the handouts. And you just look at the income, as I point out, most black Americans in solid middle-class American society.
I totally agree. Now, to my question...
you have to be quick.
This march is just like the Million Man March, and I'm wondering, what would they say if white people did that? We would be racist if we went to Washington and marched on reparations, for us, for some reason, 200 years ago. I don't understand. Everything, if we try to have any kind of organization for white people, we're racist, but, black people have all these different things that are in their favor.
We believe in double standards. We believe in that there a black Miss America, there can be a black caucus, a Hispanic caucus, but you cannot have a white caucus because we hold white people up to higher standards of behavior. And it's intolerable. We'll be back.
And now, Black by popular demand. That professor of liberty, that nemesis of liberals, that all-around nice guy, Walter E. Williams.
That's right, Johnny Donovan. Walter Williams sitting in for Rush. You guys know that while Rush was on vacation, he got a little bit of food poisoning, which caused a little bit of dehydration and the flu, and he's home. That's the good news. He's home. He's recovering, and but he's not yet not yet ready. I'm stumbling to sit behind the golden microphone at EIB, but he'll be here next week. We're going to talk to Gerald O'Driscoll at the Heritage Foundation in a few minutes. He edits along with Kim Holmes and Mary Anastasia O'Grady a yearly index of freedom, and he's going to tell us why some countries are rich and some countries are poor, and how we can avoid being like the poor ones. And somewhat related to that is a news item that's covered in the Washington Times. And it says, regulations slow slightly under Bush. Now, here's the good news. Federal agencies, issued 4,132 final rules in 2001. And that's down a couple hundred from the 4,313 issued in 2002. There's a federal rule on almost everything, which spells disaster for our nation. Here's a challenge. Tell me something that you can do, your local municipal unit can do, or your state can do, without some kind of government regulation. It is awesome. And now the regulations cost the economy $854 billion a year, the equivalent of 9% of the GNP. In 1998, the median two-earner families after-tax income of $41,000, or let's say $42,000, contain $7,410 in hidden regulatory costs. In other words, these regulatory costs eat up about 18% of the family budget. That is, regulations not free. For example, if you ask, well, what are the costs to comply with the Internal Revenue Code? That is, what is the cost to pay our taxes? Now, I'm not talking about the money that you send in. I'm talking about the costs associated with bookkeeping, accounting, finding out various rules, sitting there doing the paperwork, collecting the paperwork, and reading the rules and regulations. Well, according to one estimate, that if you took just the time, the number of hours, if you took just the hours that Americans use just simply complying with the tax code, and if you took those Americans to spend those hours in Detroit producing cars, you could produce the entire automobile output of the United States with those hours. You could produce the entire truck output and part of the aircraft industry. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that we are poorer as a nation because of these regulatory costs. I mean, it's like taking, bearing these regulatory costs, it's like taking the entire output of the automobile industry and just dumping it at sea. Now you say, well, Williams, how do you get around this? Well, there have been several proposals to get around it. One is to change the form of taxation. Some people, Congressman Dick Armey, some years ago, he suggested the flat tax. There are others around saying that we should have a national sales tax. And we'll talk about the difference between those two at some later point. But the point is that we're never going to have either one of these forms of taxation. We're never going to have simplified taxing. And matter of fact, whenever Congress says we're going to simplify taxing, it always gets more complex. You have to spend more hours. Matter of fact, I forget, it's over 50%, I believe, of people who file taxes must use a tax expert and tax accounting. That is, they're that complex. But more importantly than that, why we will never get simplified tax is that if we had, for example, as Dick Armey proposes, if we had just a simplified flat tax, that is, you have one or two deductions for maybe for a mortgage or maybe for kids, and then you just multiply your income by 0.17, whatever you have left after those deductions by 0.17 and send it in. We'll never have anything that simple. You know the reason why? Well, you just look at the two most powerful committees of Congress. One is the House Ways and Means Committee. And the other is the Senate Finance Committee. Congressmen fight tooth and nail to be on these committees. Why do they want to be on these committees? Because these are the committees that are in charge of playing tax favoritism with Americans. Now, if there were a flat, simplified tax, well, what kind of favor could congressmen give? That is, they say, well, we can't allow this deduction or this write-off, So how could they get political contributions if they can't give favors? And so no congressman wants or very few congressmen would like to have a simplified tax code because it would deny them the chance to play favorites with Americans through the tax code. Now, I get a lot of people who write and say, well, Williams, instead of having income tax that violates our freedoms, privacy and other kinds of things, why not have a national sales tax? Well, first of all, I tell those people that the important thing for us to consider is not government taxation, but government spending. That's what we need to focus on. Now, for example, if, from 1787 till 1920, the government only took 3% of the GNP, the federal government. Only 3% of the GNP except during war. Now it takes well over 20%. Now, if the government's only taking 3% of the tax of the GNP, well, then any tax code is all right. Even the complicated income tax code is all right if they only taking 3%. If the government's taking 90%, say, well, then any tax code, any means of collecting tax is bad. So what we should focus on, ladies and gentlemen, is government spending. We'll be back with your calls and Dr. Jerry O'Driscoll after this. We're back. Walter Williams sitting in for Rush, and you can be on with us by calling 800-282-2882, and you can also check out rushlimbaugh.com for classic clips and parodies. We have on with us Jerry P. O'Driscoll. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much, Walter. I'm happy to be on.
Thanks. And let me tell you something about Jerry O'Driscoll. He is a fellow graduate of UCLA. When did you graduate from?
74.
74. That was 2 years after me. And Jerry O'Driscoll, you have the distinction of being one of the few people who has written a dissertation under the supervision of my colleague and our colleague, Thomas Sowell.
That's right. That is true. He's on my committee.
Yeah, he was on your committee. And
he's a tough guy.
Oh yeah, he's a taskmaster.
He sure is.
I'm glad I didn't have anything to do with him. I left. No, but Tom Sowell was coming to UCLA just as I was leaving, and so we were able to remain friends.
Well, I put him on the committee voluntarily, and everybody told me I was nuts, but I never regretted it. He's a great, great man.
But he's quite a taskmaster, and he takes scholarly pursuits seriously.
Yes, he does.
Okay, let's talk about the 2002 Index of Economic Freedom, and it's published by the Heritage Foundation and the Wall Street Journal. And you guys have been putting this out for a number of years, haven't you?
This year will be our 9th. The 2002 edition was the 8th, and we're working on the 9th.
Oh, good. Now, in the promo for it, you say, well, you know why countries are rich. Some countries are rich, and some are very poor. Can you help us, our audience?
Economic freedom. That is the ability to make a living without the government taxing or regulating you to death, and also with the government doing the one thing it needs to do, which is to protect your property from internal and external threats.
Yeah, that's the vision of our United States Constitution, isn't it?
It is very much so.
To do so. Now tell me, you rank countries in terms of their economic freedom. What are the arguments that you use for the ranking?
Well, we have a lot of data that we use, and it's all publicly available, and it comes from surprising sources like the IMF, so nobody's going to say that we cook the data. And we have a system for assessing things like the strength of property rights in a country, and academic research has shown that the way we measure economic freedom explains the differences in wealth across countries.
And you have indicators of the extent to which government regulates the economy, the stability of the money supply?
Yes, we measure inflation, and something you said a few minutes ago is absolutely right, that ultimately you cannot do anything about taxes without doing something about government spending, because as Milton Friedman taught us, government spending is the ultimate tax on an economy.
That is absolutely right. Now, I, as an American, I am somewhat embarrassed by the idea that there's some countries that are more economically free than United States.
That is true.
And can you kind of list them?
Yeah, there are 3 countries that are freer than the United States: Hong Kong, which has always been number 1, Singapore, and New Zealand. And New Zealand is surprising because they have a labor government right now. But all 3 of those economies are among the most open in the world and have embraced free trade, which has made their country and their economies more dynamic.
And so we get a lot of flack on the show from people. We've been critical of the George Bush's push for tariffs on foreign steel, and people say, well, look, we need these tariffs. We need restrictions on trade. They're going in the wrong direction, aren't they?
They absolutely are, and they're hurting American industry. In fact, if there's a single thing that may slow this recovery, it's these movements toward protectionism. For every 1 job in the steel industry that's being protected, 57 jobs in industries that use steel are being exposed.
And one of the things, see, that's the phenomena that we sometimes talk about in economics, where they're visible beneficiaries and invisible victims, whereby the congressman can go over, he can say, look, I saved this job at U.S. Steel, and Williams and Driscoll did not want me to, and so but look, I made this accomplishment. But nobody would attribute to that congressman's, the unemployment, and let's say in the tractor industry, the steel using industries, nobody quite makes that connection between the action of Congress or the president and the unemployment in those areas.
That's right. There's a little company in California that makes steel garage doors, and they used imported steel from, I think, Australia, and they didn't get an exemption on this tariff, and they are now out of business, and there are 200 people who've lost their jobs. Those are the jobs lost, but you have to collect those stories, and it's harder to find them than the so-called job you've saved.
Yeah, absolutely right. Now, in terms of, it seems like, and I've always said this, and I believe in your looking through your index of economic freedom, you can say the following. That is, if you took if you look at all the nations, you made a list of nations, let's say in the United Nations, and let's say you rank those nations by per capita income, and you rank those nations by countries that are closer to open markets and those countries that are communism with a lot of government regulation, and then you took Amnesty International's ranking of human rights protections, you would find a rather strange correlation.
You would.
Or surprising correlation.
We've done it. We've taken that, made that very correlation. Countries that are economically free, protect civil society, protect people's human rights, protect the environment, and protect workers. That's the best protection, is freedom.
Yeah, right. And those countries, they find when they're economically free, they are wealthier, and they have greater protections of human rights.
That is correct. If you look at the countries that are at the bottom of our list, the flip side, these are the disasters. These are the countries that harbor terrorism. These are the poorest countries in the world. They're North Korea, they're Cuba, they're Iraq, they're Iran, they're Syria. I mean, if you want to explain the violence in the Middle East, the problem is the repressed economies. Yeah,
right. And on the continent of Africa, there's only one country that ranks fairly high. And what is that, Mauritius?
Yes, there's just a few. It's very sad. It's very sad.
And matter of fact, most of the countries in Africa, the people are worse off now than they were under colonialism, both economically and in terms of human rights.
That is absolutely true. That is absolutely true. 6 of the 7 freest economies in the world are the former colony of the 7th. That is, 6 of the freest economies in the world used to be colonies of Great Britain, and those 7 countries are 7 of the top 10.
Yeah, right. United States, Canada,
Hong Kong, Singapore, New Zealand,
and Australia,
and Ireland. Yes.
Yeah, right.
Australia. Yes.
Yeah.
And if you take a dramatic example, Chile is a country of 16 million people. It's not the top. It's only number 9 on our list. 16 million people. There was more foreign direct investment in Chile last year than in India, a country of 1 billion.
That's right. And by the way, a country that's having a lot of trouble right now is Argentina. And Argentina at one time was the 9th richest country in the world.
I know, it's a disaster. It's the saddest thing in the world, and it's the fact that they have not for a long time had the rule of law, and they've never been able to bring prosperity, not modern times, to the ordinary Argentine.
Thanks a lot, Jerry, for coming on and talking to us about the 2002 Index of Economic Freedom. And people can maybe get that where? At the Heritage Foundation?
At the Heritage website, www.heritage.org.
Okay. Well, we'll try to get a link to that, and I think it's great work. And please give my regards to your colleagues who assisted you writing the book.
They're all listening today.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jerry.
Bye.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was Jerry O'Driscoll, one of my former colleagues that went to school with me at UCLA, one of the greatest economics departments in our country. That was Jerry O'Driscoll, a colleague of mine. He's at the Heritage Foundation. He was on to talk to us about the Index of Economic Freedom. And you should keep in mind, folks, what he said, and what I've said many times, that anybody that wishes to, that wants tariffs on wood or want to restrict international competition by having tariffs on steel or tariffs on anything, they are asking for Americans to be poor. They are asking for more poverty for America. Now, let me be clear. Now, if the steel industry gets tariffs, the people in the steel industry, the workers and the owners, the shareholders, they will be richer. Clearly, they will be richer. But America will be poorer. And as Jerry said, that for each job that's saved by in the steel industry, there are scores of jobs lost elsewhere, and that is because when you raise the price of steel, the people who use steel, the companies that use steel, find themselves at a competitive disadvantage in both the domestic and international market. That is, for example, that is as International Harvesting Machine Company uses steel to make its product. Now, when you have tariffs on foreign steel, it drives up the price of steel as the tariffs have. And so that means that International Harvester must pay higher price for steel. And so what it does, it enables, let's say, it puts the International Harvesting Machine Company at a competitive disadvantage with, let's say, a Japanese manufacturer of its competitive product. So there is no free lunch. The only thing about this is that the beneficiaries of the tariffs are visible. They have their jobs saved, they're earning more profit, and they're easily identifiable. They're visible, and they know who to vote for. The victims, the people who lose their jobs, that are far more numerous than the beneficiaries, they don't know why they lost their job. And so the politicians can blame it on evil spirits, the Middle East crisis, the 9/11. They can blame it on anything. But the people who lose their jobs, the direct connection is not made between you are losing your job so that a steel maker can get a higher wage, so that a steel company can earn higher profits, and that owners, shareholders of steel companies can get higher dividends. That's why you're losing your job. That's what I would like to have a politician, an honest politician, tell those people who are losing their jobs. Let's go to the phones. Ron in Canton, is it Connecticut?
It is Connecticut.
Yeah, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to speak to you. I hope someday that you will deign to pursue your educational career as a full-time radio host, because you're great at this, Walter.
Well, thank you.
Last week we were discussing a little bit the erosion, or really virtual repeal, of the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, and I wanted to make a couple of points about a couple of things that I think have greatly undercut the rights of the states. The first one is way overbroad interpretation of the interstate commerce clause of the Constitution.
Oh, it's a joke.
It is a joke. It was only intended to prevent the states from setting up barriers to trade.
Yeah, right, absolutely.
And now we have things like, now the federal government asserts itself in all kinds of nonsense. I think that it's, at some level, the roots of the federal campaign against drugs, for example, relies in part on the interstate commerce clause.
Now, I'll let you get finished, but I want to make an insert here, because I don't know whether you heard of it. I don't know whether the listeners out here, but there's a Supreme Court case in the early 40s where a farmer was growing food on his own property for his own family. That's all that he was doing. And the government wanted to regulate him, and they said that he was affecting interstate commerce, and therefore he came under government control. And the reason why he was affecting interstate commerce, the reasoning of the court, the Supreme Court is that if he weren't growing his own food, he would be buying food from out of the state.
Ah, boy. I tell you, one of the things it just boggles the mind, and I think everybody should, every 10 years, everybody should sit down and read the Federalist and think about these things.
That's right. And just one more point before you go on, is that there was a case, Lopez versus somebody, I forget the other person, maybe it's the government of the United States. Anyway, it was a regulation on guns around school, and it's a Supreme Court case. And the people said, well, the government was arguing that to prevent guns around the school affected interstate commerce because it affected education, and education affected interstate commerce. Now, Justice Antonio Scalia asked Drew Day, who was the Solicitor General, he asked him, could you tell me anything that Congress cannot do that's not covered by the Interstate Commerce Clause? And Drew Days could not come up with an answer. Now, I was having dinner with Scalia one time. I criticized Scalia. I said, you know what I would have done? If he couldn't come up with the answer, I would have closed the court. And I'd say, okay, Drew Days, you have a week to come back with an answer. But go on with the other point. You were talking about
Yes.
the Senate.
Yes. The other point was, I think one of the things that formerly protected the rights of the states was the fact that the senators from each state were elected by the most numerous house of the state's legislature, which meant that the state lawmakers were the guys who decided who got to be a senator. And if the state lawmakers perceive themselves to have an interest in protecting their state's rights, their prerogatives to make laws for their people, then, God help the senator who would trample the state's rights.
They could just recall him.
Exactly, but or just certainly not reelect him.
Yeah.
Now, sold to the people under the notion that it was somehow more democratic, we have the direct election of senators. And of course what this means is that you can get basically federally or nationally orchestrated campaigns about various policies and so forth.
That's
and
right.
basically ride roughshod over the states because you can get the people to elect senators who, where the people either deliberately or inadvertently have no perception of protecting their state's rights.
And you're absolutely right. And there were two mistakes at once. What you're talking about, what he's talking about, ladies and gentlemen, is the 17th Amendment that put senators subject to the popular vote. Is that right?
That's correct.
And the 18th Amendment, which came after that, which got rid of drink.
Yeah, well, two mistakes in a row.
That's right. Look,
Walter, I very much enjoy the scholarship, the history, and the economic perspective you bring on the show. I don't always agree with you, but I would love to hear a lot of this.
Okay, well, thanks very much for calling in, and let's go to Kathleen in Toledo, Ohio. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Walter. You're my favorite substitute for Rush.
Oh, thank you.
I have a question. I was having a discussion with my brother-in-law about the steel industry, and he said that without the tariffs, countries would pour inferior steel into the country, and that the tariffs protect us from that. Now, I need an intelligent comeback for that.
Well, now, would you buy a bad steel coming in from, let's say, Belgium? If
I
you
would
were
not, but he feels that big companies would do that to pass on to unknowing people.
Oh, my God. Save us from our stupidity.
Yes, and he works for the government.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that is utter nonsense. And this dumping argument that people give, that is selling steel for a price lower than they sell it in their own country. I mean, that argument is specious. That is, many companies sell products in the international market for lower prices than they sell it in their domestic market. It's just a form of pricing called price discrimination.
Okay.
And so, but his argument is saying, well, look, we have to have tariffs on foreign steel because steel buyers in America are too dumb to be able to sell the difference between high-quality steel and low-quality steel, or they're conniving and they would buy low-quality steel and make bridges with the low-quality steel, and the bridges would collapse, and we poor Americans would die. And so, therefore, we need the saving of government officials to prevent this from happening to us. We'll be back with your calls after this.
You're listening to the EIB Network.
Walter Williams holding forth before the golden EIB microphone, pushing back the frontiers of ignorance and trying to sell my fellow Americans on the moral superiority of liberty. And that is a hard job to do, but let's go to the phones. Larry from Statesville, North Carolina, welcome to the show.
Hello, Mr. Williams. Glad to be on the show with you. I'd love to hear you.
Well, thank you.
I heard your comments a couple times about the taxes and whether and the government spending. I agree with you that the government just wastes all of our tax dollars, but I still like the idea of the consumption tax or sales tax because everybody then would have to pay it, because we have so many people come in this country legally or illegally or drug dealers or whatever who buy lots of items but never pay income tax per se. And I think that way that would free up, make everybody pay their fair share. Plus, it would get rid of all those crazy forms from the IRS and actually dismantle the IRS.
Well, now here's one of the problems with the national sales tax, and that is, I fear that to have a national sales tax an effective national sales tax would require an agency more oppressive than the IRS. Now, why do I say that? Well, there are plenty of chances for evasion of a national sales tax so far as services are concerned. That is, I mean, I come fix your plumbing, and you say, well, here, Williams, here's $30. We're off the books. Or I do many kinds of things that I can perform many services that would not necessarily go down as a purchase. And in order to enforce the national sales tax, you would need a very, very oppressive agency.
Well, I can see your point there, but the states had to do it. I mean, we have state sales tax.
Yeah.
Like to me, that way I'd have a choice. They won't confiscate my money from my check. If I want to go buy a car, I'll buy a car.
But here it is. There, in order to, and I don't worship revenue neutral, but just to raise the same amount of money that the current tax system raises, the national sales tax would have to be about 27%. And particularly if you allow exclusions for, you won't have a national sales tax on prescription drugs or foods or things like this. So 20%, 27% gives a lot of incentive for evasion, whereby a 6% does not give as much.
Okay, well, I see your point there.
So what we have to do, again and again, stress the notion that we have to focus on government spending. I mean, it's kind of like, it's similar to, you're asking me, look, Williams, you're going to be crucified. Do you want to carry the cross, or do you want the cross sitting there all ready for you? I mean, well, clearly, not having the burden of carrying the cross would be nicer, but I don't want to be crucified. And so we should talk about crucifixion as opposed to whether I want to carry the cross or just be nailed right there. Let's go to Brian in Pennsylvania. Welcome to the show.
Dr. Williams, you're one of my heroes. Thank you for everything you do.
Thank you.
How do you answer the argument made by a steel industry friend of mine that it's the foreign countries who started the whole tariff problem by subsidizing their own steel industries and thus forcing our domestic companies to respond with our own tariffs just to, so to speak, level the playing field?
Well, I would respond like this. I would ask the fellow, well, if you and I were in a boat at sea, and I shoot a hole in my end of the boat, would you say, okay, Williams, I'm going to get even with you. I'm going to shoot a hole in my end of the boat. Now, that's like saying, well, look, maybe if Germany rips off its taxpayers to subsidize steel, you're going to say, the Congress is going to say, okay, we're going to get even with you, Germany. We're going to rip off Americans in the name of subsidizing steel. So here's what I say. I know many countries impose tariffs and restrictions, regulations, and maybe subsidies. But here's what I say. Look, we are such a big country that has a very, very large domestic market that if I were president of the United States, if I had the power, I would say, look, rest of the world, we're going to be a free trade country. Goods can come in our country with no taxes, no tariffs on them. And if you want to rip off your people, do so. If you want to send us free steel, we'll just kind of say to our steel workers, why don't you go on vacation for a couple months because Japan is sending us some free steel and you can be sitting out on the beach. I mean,
that hurts Japan's economy in the long run.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That is, and so here's what congressmen are saying. They're saying, look, we're going to, as long as Japan screws its citizens, we're going to screw you, Americans, to make a level playing field. That is offensive and stupid for me. We'll be back with your calls after this.
You're listening to the EIB Network.
Working with WTIC for a better Connecticut.
Our own national defense.
Well, you stockpile, but what I heard people saying is that for national security, we need to put a tariff on foreign steel. Now, tell me, what do you think a tariff does to the price of steel?
Raises it.
It raises the price. Is the nation more secure in terms of being able to defend ourselves with higher steel prices or lower steel prices?
Well,
Which can you make more tanks? You make more tanks?
Yeah, you're leading me down the primrose path. What if we're not able to get any steel because we've given up our production facilities and we've been relying on foreign steel from other countries, and now we're cut off?
Do you believe that would ever happen?
I think it would be a rare case. That's why I said it would be a rare situation.
But, people paint those scenarios to feather their own nest, to get into my pocketbook. But thanks a lot. And do we have time to go to Tuscaloosa, Alabama? Let's go to Fred. Welcome to the show. You have to be kind of quick. We're up against the clock.
All right. Thank you. Hello, Walter.
Yes.
Glad to be talking to you. We were brought up with a thing earlier about reparations and how to pay for them. First off, I'd like to say that you're pushing back the parameters of ignorance.
Yeah.
And Frank Zappa said there is more ignorance than hydrogen in the universe, and it has a lot of more shelf life.
That's right. That's right. That
the government
is an astute observation from one of our astute listeners, and that's why you should always tune in to get these words of wisdom. We will see you later, but hang in there.